Mm. I was sitting at the kitchen table going through my mail when my son-in-law walked in, looked right at me, and said, "We need to talk about the arrangement." Not good morning. Not hello. Just that. I had been living with my daughter Claire and her husband Derek for about 7 months at that point. After my wife, Margaret, passed, pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end, the house in Barrie felt too big and too quiet at the same time. Claire called me every other day for 3 months before I finally said yes. She said it would be good for all of us. She said Derek was on board. She said they had a spare room set up and everything. I believed her. She was my daughter. Why wouldn't I? The arrangement, as Derek called it, was simple enough. I paid them $1,200 a month. Not rent, Claire insisted, just contributing to the household. Which I suppose made everyone feel better about it. I also covered my own groceries, my own prescriptions, and I drove Claire to her appointments on Tuesdays because Derek was always busy with work. I didn't mind any of it. I had my pension from 31 years at the municipality. I had Margaret's life insurance, and I was 64 years old with nowhere particular to be. Helping out felt like purpose. Derek worked in sales, software sales, the kind where you're always on a call, always closing something, always using words like leverage and pipeline and scalable. He was 38. He wore dress shirts, even on Saturdays. We had never been close. Even before Margaret died, family dinners had a kind of careful politeness to them, conversations that stayed near the surface. But I had always figured that was just the nature of in-laws. You love who your kids love, and you make it work. What he said that morning was this: the $1,200 wasn't enough anymore. He wanted $1,600, effective the 1st of next month. He said it casually, standing at the counter pouring his coffee, like he was telling me the weather had changed. I asked him if he'd talked to Claire about it. He said Claire agreed with him. I nodded slowly. I told him I'd think about it. He said there wasn't much to think about. Then he picked up his coffee and walked out. I sat there for a long time after that. The mail was still in my hand. There was a notice from Service Canada, an electric bill I'd offered to split with them months ago, and Claire had said wasn't necessary, a flyer for a hardware store I'd never been to. I put them all down in a neat stack, and I looked out the window at the backyard, at the bird feeder I'd put up in October because Claire had mentioned she liked cardinals. I thought about Margaret. I thought about what she would have said. She had a way of cutting through things, very gently, without any drama. She would have looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Raymond, something's not right here." She would have been correct. I didn't say anything to Claire that day. Or the next. I went about my routine. Morning coffee, a walk around the neighborhood, helping with whatever needed doing around the house. Derek left for work early and came home late, and we exchanged maybe 40 words a week. Claire seemed normal, cheerful even, and I started to wonder if Derek had really told her what he'd said to me, or some softened version of it. Then, about 2 weeks later, I came downstairs on a Sunday morning to find Derek on the phone in the living room. He didn't hear me on the stairs. The house had thick carpet in the hallway, something I'd always found a bit excessive, but that morning I was grateful for it. He was talking about a property. An investment property, he said. He was talking about cash flow and equity and a down payment that was almost ready. He laughed at something the person on the other end said. That easy, confident laugh he used when he wanted someone to trust him. I went back upstairs. I made myself wait 3 days before I did anything with what I'd heard. I am not a man who acts on instinct when the stakes are high. 31 years in municipal administration teaches you that. You document, you verify, you make sure you understand what you're looking at before you put your name on anything. On Wednesday afternoon, while Claire was at her yoga class and Derek was at work, I sat down at my laptop at the kitchen table and I started looking. It wasn't hard to find. Derek had a LinkedIn profile that he kept meticulously updated, the kind that reads like a brochure. But if you scrolled back far enough, past the current employer, past the one before that, there was a gap, 14 months roughly. No explanation, no entry at all. People have gaps for all kinds of reasons. I knew that. But it snagged my attention the way a loose thread does. I called my old colleague Paul, who had retired from the municipality 2 years before me and done a short stint with a credit investigation firm. I didn't tell him why I was asking. I just asked him what a person could find if they were trying to understand someone's financial history. What was public? what was accessible, what you'd need a professional for. He talked for about 20 minutes. I took notes on a yellow legal pad, the kind I'd used for budget meetings for 3 decades. I want to be clear about something. I was not trying to destroy my son-in-law. I was not looking for ammunition. I was a 64-year-old widower who had been asked to pay $400 more a month for a spare room in his daughter's house by a man who was already talking about investment properties in the same week. I wanted to understand what I was living inside of. That's all. What I found over the next 10 days I found carefully and legally and mostly through public records that anyone with a computer and enough patience could access. In Ontario, the court records database is searchable. It takes some navigation, but it's there. Derek's name appeared in a civil judgment from 4 years ago. A creditor, a private lending company out of Mississauga, had successfully sued him for just over $31,000. The judgment had been registered. Whether it had been satisfied, I couldn't determine from the public record alone. I also found, through a combination of the land registry and a conversation with a woman at the county clerk's office who was helpful in the way that small office government workers sometimes are, when you're polite and patient with them, that Derek had owned a condo in Hamilton. He'd bought it in 2019. He'd sold it in 2021, during the peak of the market. He would have made money on that sale. Possibly significant money. So there had been money. And then, apparently, there hadn't been enough of it. I thought about the investment property conversation I'd overheard. I thought about the timeline. I thought about what a down payment in this market looks like in the Greater Toronto area for anything with a positive cash flow. And I thought about my $1,200 a month and the ask to raise it to $1,600, and I thought about it very carefully. I didn't sleep well for several nights. Not because I was angry. I was past anger by that point. Or maybe I'd never quite arrived at it. I was something quieter than angry. I was sad, and I was careful, and I was thinking. I called my daughter on a Tuesday afternoon. I knew Derek would be in the city for a client meeting. He'd mentioned it at dinner the night before. I asked Claire if she wanted to have lunch, just the two of us, at that Thai place she liked on Dunlop Street. She said yes, of course, she'd love that. We sat across from each other at a small table near the window. She looked like her mother around the eyes, always had. I ordered the green curry. She ordered the same thing she always ordered, pad see ew, no spice. I let her talk for a while. She told me about a colleague at work who was going on mat leave, about a book she was reading, about how she and Derek were thinking about maybe getting a dog at some point. Normal things, good things. Then I put my fork down and I said, Claire, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be honest with me. She looked at me. She has her mother's eyes, but she has my way of going very still when she's listening. I asked her if she knew about the civil judgment, the $31,000. She didn't say anything for a long moment. I asked her if she knew what the money from the Hamilton condo had been used for. She looked out the window. A woman was walking a golden retriever on the sidewalk outside. We both watched it for a second. He told me it was dealt with, she said finally. He said the condo money covered it. I asked her if she'd seen documentation of that. She didn't answer right away. I didn't push. I just waited. 31 years of meetings had taught me the value of silence, too. Dad, she said, what are you not telling me? So I told her. All of it. The conversation at the coffee counter, the LinkedIn gap, what I'd found in the public records, the investment property phone call. I told her slowly and clearly, the way you deliver information that matters, without drama and without editorializing. I put the yellow legal pad on the table between us. I had written the key details out in point form. She read through it. She didn't cry. She asked 2 or 3 questions, precise ones, and I answered them as precisely as I could. Then she folded her hands on the table and she said, I need to talk to him. I said I understood. I told her to take whatever time she needed. I told her I wasn't going anywhere, and I meant it both practically and in every other sense. What happened over the next 2 weeks I was not present for. Claire and Derek had conversations I was not part of, some of them loud enough that I stayed in my room and watched hockey on my laptop with headphones. I gave them space. I cooked dinner on the nights I could tell things were bad, just left it on the stove and went back upstairs. At some point, Claire asked to see Derek's full financial picture. She had a right to it. They filed jointly. She hired a fee-only financial advisor, a woman named Sandra, who came to the house on a Wednesday evening and sat with them at the kitchen table for 2 hours. I went for a long walk around the neighborhood. It was early March, cold and gray, the snow going dirty on the lawns. When I got back, Derek's car was gone. Claire was sitting in the kitchen. She had a cup of tea in front of her, and the legal pad I'd left with her, which she'd annotated in the margins in her own handwriting. She looked up when I came in. "The condo money," she said. "He used most of it to pay back his brother. Informal loan. Nothing on paper. And then he started the investment property fund, as he calls it, with what was left." She paused. "Our savings account has about $11,000 in it. We have $240,000 left on the mortgage." I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "He wanted your $1,200, she said. "He wanted $1,600. He was going to use it toward the down payment." I didn't say anything. "He wasn't going to tell me," she said. There it was. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She was quiet for a while. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car went by slowly on the wet street. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she said. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. She said, "You could have just paid the extra $400. You didn't have to do any of this." I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Margaret again, about the way she would look at me across the kitchen table after a long day, and how much I used to take for granted that she would always be there. "I did it because you're my daughter," I said, "and because you deserve to know what was happening in your own house." Derek moved out at the end of the month. It was not a dramatic exit. He packed bags over several days, methodical and quiet, and he was polite to me in passing in a way that was worse than hostility somehow. That careful politeness that meant there was nothing left to say. I helped him carry a lamp out to his car on the last day because it was awkward and heavy and I happened to be there. He thanked me. I said, of course. Claire filed for separation in April. She found a good lawyer, a woman her colleague recommended, who had a small office on Bayfield Street and charged fair rates. I kept paying the $1,200. Claire tried to refuse it. I told her the roof kept her warm, the same as it kept me warm, and I wasn't going to sit in her house for free. We compromised on $800. She bought a bird feeder for the backyard to match the one I'd put up, so now there were two. I'm not going to tell you the year since then has been easy. Divorce, even separation, even the early stages of it, is its own kind of grief. Claire has hard days. We talk more than we used to. She asks me about her mother sometimes, small things, what Margaret liked to cook, what she was like when Claire was very young, and I answer as honestly as I can. What I will tell you is this. The morning after Derek moved out, I came downstairs and Claire was making eggs. She was listening to the radio, some CBC morning program, and she was singing along very quietly to herself, the way she used to do in her bedroom when she was a teenager and didn't think anyone could hear. I sat down at the kitchen table. She put a plate in front of me without being asked. I drank my coffee. Outside at the feeder, there were two cardinals, a male and a female. The male was very red against the gray March sky, the way cardinals always are in winter, ridiculous and vivid and impossible to miss. I thought about how Margaret had loved them. I thought about how some things find you when you stop waiting for them. I didn't say any of that out loud. I just drank my coffee and I watched the birds, and I was glad I had stayed. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Not ruminate. I'm too old and too tired for rumination. But actually sit with it, the way you sit with something that changed the shape of your life without announcing itself first. What Derek did wasn't evil. I want to be honest about that. He wasn't a villain in a movie. He was a man who had made financial decisions he was ashamed of, who had found a way to quietly correct them using someone else's money, and who had convinced himself along the way that what he was doing was reasonable. That's not evil. That's something more ordinary and more dangerous. It's what happens when a person stops being honest with the people closest to them, and then has to keep building on top of that first dishonesty to keep it standing. I've done the same thing in smaller ways, in my own life. I think most of us have. You make one choice you're not proud of, and then you make another choice to protect the first one, and before long you've built something that requires constant maintenance just to keep from falling over. The difference is whether the people around you pay the cost of that maintenance. Claire paid it. She paid it in a marriage she thought was one thing and turned out to be another. She paid it in the gap between what Derek told her, and what was actually in their savings account. She paid it in months of small erosions. The way he talked over her sometimes, the way big decisions were already made by the time she heard about them, that she'd explained away because explaining away is easier than looking directly at something that frightens you. I don't blame her for any of it. I want to be very clear about that. She was doing what people do when they love someone and have built a life with them. She was giving him the benefit of the doubt. That's not weakness. That's what it looks like to trust someone. What I think about now is the question of when to speak and when to wait. I waited a long time before I said anything to Claire. Some people would say I waited too long. Maybe they're right, but I needed to understand what I was looking at before I put it in front of my daughter. Because once you say something like that to someone you love, you can't unsay it. And if you're wrong, you've done damage that doesn't repair easily. I wasn't wrong, but I thought hard about the possibility that I could be. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting older. You get better at sitting with uncertainty. You get better at doing the uncomfortable work before you open your mouth, not because you become passive. I was not passive in those 3 weeks I spent going through public records and talking to Paul and thinking through timelines, but because you've lived long enough to know that being right isn't the same as being helpful, and being loud isn't the same as being effective. Margaret understood that. She was the quietest effective person I've ever known. I think about Claire singing to herself in the kitchen that morning after Derek left. Small and ordinary and real, that image does something to me I don't have a clean word for. What I know is this: I stayed. Not because I had nowhere to go, but because she was my daughter and something wasn't right, and I was in a position to pay attention. And paying attention, done carefully and honestly and without an agenda beyond the truth, turned out to matter. That's not a lesson I could have taught Derek. Some things you only learn by living the consequences of not knowing them yet.